My delicate fingers traced along the worn leather belt, feeling its smooth texture as I inspected the loose buckle. My stepson Evan stood close to me, his muscular frame towering over her as she worked. The afternoon sun streaming through the bedroom window highlighted the sheen of sweat on his neck. "Hold still," she murmured, her breath catching as her knuckles brushed against his firm abdomen. The belt needed a new hole punched, and Claire found herself becoming increasingly aware of their proximity. His masculine scent, a mix of cedar cologne and natural musk, filled her senses. "Like this?" Evan's low voice rumbled above her, his hands settling on her shoulders. The innocent touch sent electricity through her body. Claire's red-polished fingers fumbled with the leather, her chest rising and falling rapidly. I need to concentrate," she whispered, but made no move to step back. The belt slipped from her grasp, falling forgotten to the floor. Evan's hands slid down her bare arms, leaving trails of fire in their wake. Claire tilted her head back, meeting his heated gaze. His fingers tangled in her chestnut waves, drawing her closer. "We shouldn't," she breathed, even as her body arched toward him. "Shh," he soothed, one hand splaying possessively across her lower back. Their lips met in a searing kiss, years of repressed desire flowing between them. Claire melted against his broad chest with a soft moan as his tongue skillfully parted her lips. The belt lay forgotten on the floor as they surrendered to their forbidden passion, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. I want to share you more of that night, but that is for later on in the story. Let me tell you how I got to that part with Evan, my stepson. When Daniel died, I learned two things. Silence could be louder than any noise, and grief was the heaviest thing a person could carry. I still remember the first day I stood in this house after the funeral. The world outside was moving. Cars drove past, birds still chirped, people went about their lives. But inside, everything was frozen. A cold, hushed void, the kind of silence that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. I stood there with my keys in hand, staring at the photographs lining the hallway. Daniel holding a much younger Evan on his shoulders at the beach. Daniel laughing in the backyard, barbecue tongs in hand. A photo of all three of us, me, Daniel, and Evan, at Christmas last year. In that picture, Evan sat stiffly on the couch, his mouth pressed into a thin line, while I smiled too widely to cover the awkwardness. That was us. A half-finished family, a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. But even half-finished, we'd been something. Now Daniel was gone, and it was just me and Evan. Evan was 12 when it happened. He stood at the funeral with his hands stuffed in his pockets, staring at the casket like he was daring it to move. He didn't cry. I did. Enough for both of us. People whispered behind us, murmuring about how strong he was. They didn't understand that Evan wasn't strong. He was angry. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched and his eyes stayed fixed on the dirt. We drove home in silence that day. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, hoping for something, anything, to tell me how to reach him. He sat slumped in his seat, his eyes on the passing trees. When we pulled into the driveway, I said the first thing that came to mind. "Are you hungry?" He didn't even look at me. No. I didn't know what to do, so I let him disappear into his room. I heard his door close, and just like that, I was alone. In the weeks that followed, I tried to be everything I thought he needed. I cooked dinners he never ate. I asked him about school only to get shrugs and one-word answers. The social worker came once to check on us. She was polite but blunt. "He's at a fragile age," she told me. "Losing a father, especially a second loss if his mother passed early, can lead to behavioral issues." "He's not acting out," I said quickly, defending him. "He's just quiet." The social worker gave me a look I couldn't decipher. "If you need support, counseling, parenting resources, don't hesitate to ask." I never asked. How could I? I wasn't a mother. I was barely his stepmother. But I was the only one left. The turning point came on a Thursday evening. I'd started leaving food outside his door. Small things I knew he liked. Grilled cheese, tea with a bit of honey, apple slices. Most nights, the plates would stay untouched, and I'd carry them back to the sink, feeling like a failure. That night, though, the plate was empty when I checked. For the first time, I felt hope curl in my chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later, I heard footsteps downstairs and followed them cautiously. I found Evan in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, fiddling with his camera. It was the first time I'd seen him out of his room in weeks. "Hey," I said softly, as if I might scare him off. He didn't look up. "The battery's dead." I stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. "Does it need a special charger?" He nodded, still not meeting my gaze. "Okay. Well, let's figure it out tomorrow. I can drive you to the camera shop after school." To my surprise, he didn't protest. Instead, he traced the edge of the lens with his thumb and murmured, "My dad said cameras never lie." Something in my chest twisted. I took a few steps closer and sat down on the couch, not too far from him, but not too close either. "What do you mean?" Evan's shoulders hunched slightly. "Pictures don't pretend. People pretend, but a picture shows everything the way it is." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I watched him turn the camera over in his hands like it was something sacred. For the first time, I realized the camera wasn't just a hobby. It was a lifeline, something he could trust. That was the first night he let me sit with him. Over the next few weeks, the ice began to thaw, slowly but noticeably. I started asking him about the pictures he took, and sometimes he'd show me. "There's nothing special about it," he said one afternoon, handing me a photograph. It was a shot of the oak tree in our backyard, its branches stretching wide against a stormy sky. I turned it over in my hands, trying to put into words what I felt. "It looks strong," I said finally. Evan didn't answer, but for just a second, I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. One afternoon, we were driving back from the camera shop when I made a mistake. "What was your mom like?" I asked. I hadn't meant to pry, but the question slipped out before I could stop it. Evan's face hardened, and he stared out the window. "I don't remember her," he said flatly. I gripped the steering wheel. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's fine," he cut me off, his voice cold. The wall came back up, and I knew I'd crossed a line. That night, I left dinner at his door, but didn't hear him move. When I woke up in the morning, the plate was still there. I didn't make the same mistake again. Still, there were moments that gave me hope. One evening, I found Evan in the backyard, crouched low with his camera. I watched him for a while before finally stepping outside. "What are you taking pictures of?" He didn't look up. "There's a nest under the porch." I glanced at the house. "Birds?" "Yeah, babies." I smiled softly and leaned against the railing. "Can I see?" He hesitated, then stood up and walked over to me, holding the camera out. I bent down and peered at the screen. The shot was beautiful. Tiny, open beaks reaching toward the sky, waiting for food. Life, fragile and hungry. "They're lucky to have their mom," Evan murmured. The words hung between us, heavy and unspoken. I looked at him then, at the boy who wasn't really mine, and felt something shift in me. "They're lucky to have someone watching over them," I said quietly. Evan glanced at me, and for the first time he didn't look away. That was how it started. Small moments, tiny cracks in the wall between us. I didn't know then how much those moments would matter, or how far they would take us. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to leave. No matter how far apart we still felt, I'd stay. Because no one else would. And no one else should have to. The mornings were quiet in the house. Evan would get up early, padding downstairs in his socks to grab a bowl of cereal before school. I'd hear the faint scrape of the chair against the tile as he sat at the kitchen table, the sound of his spoon clinking against the bowl. I'd started waking up earlier just to be there when he was. Not because he needed me, but because I wanted to be present, to remind him, in the smallest ways, that I wasn't going anywhere. "Morning," I said one day as I walked into the kitchen. Evan glanced up, his hair messy, his hoodie slung loosely over his shoulders. "Morning." It wasn't much, but it was more than I used to get. "Want toast?" I asked, grabbing the bread from the counter. He shook his head. "I'm good." I lingered by the toaster anyway, listening to the hum of the fridge and the rain tapping against the window. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was familiar, even comforting. "Your teacher called yesterday," I said after a moment. Evan stiffened slightly. "Why?" "Just to say you've been doing well in art class." His shoulders relaxed, and a faint hint of a smile played on his lips. "It's not that hard." I turned to him, leaning against the counter. "Maybe not for you. You've got an eye for that kind of thing." He didn't answer, but I caught the smallest flicker of pride in his expression before he stood and carried his bowl to the sink. Moments like that kept me going. They were proof that little by little, we were figuring this out together. That afternoon, I came home early from work. The rain hadn't let up all day, and the house felt damp and chilly when I walked in. I set my bag down and called out, "Evan?" No answer. I figured he was upstairs, probably working on homework or editing photos on his computer. I started up the stairs, my footsteps soft on the carpet, and paused outside his door. The faint sound of running water reached my ears, and I realized he was in the shower. I turned to head back downstairs when his door creaked open slightly. Steam billowed out into the hallway, and for a split second, I caught sight of him stepping out of the bathroom. He had a towel wrapped around his waist, his damp hair clinging to his forehead. His shoulders were broader than I'd noticed before, his chest lean and defined. He was still a boy in so many ways, but in that moment he looked older, like someone I didn't quite recognize. I froze. It wasn't the sight of him that startled me. It was the way my breath caught in my throat, the way my heart skipped a beat. A rush of guilt followed immediately, sharp and suffocating. I quickly turned away, my face burning, and hurried back downstairs. I tried to shake the moment from my mind, but it lingered like a shadow for the rest of the evening. When Evan came downstairs later, dressed in his usual hoodie and jeans, he seemed oblivious to my turmoil. He grabbed a soda from the fridge and plopped down on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at me. "Yeah," I said too quickly. "Why wouldn't I be?" He shrugged, his attention already back on his screen. I busied myself with cleaning up the kitchen, scrubbing the counters harder than necessary. The rational part of me knew that what I'd felt, what I'd seen, was nothing. A fleeting reaction, a trick of the mind. But the irrational part of me, the part I couldn't quite control, whispered something else. A week later, the incident was still haunting me. I found myself avoiding Evan in subtle ways, leaving the room when he walked in, keeping my conversations with him brief. I told myself it was for the best, that I needed space to sort through my emotions, but deep down, I knew I was pulling away because I was afraid. Evan noticed. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked one evening as we sat at the dinner table. I looked up from my plate, startled. "What?" "You've been weird lately," he said, his tone cautious. I forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a little stressed from work." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press me further. Instead, he pushed his plate away and muttered, "Whatever." I watched him retreat to his room, my chest tightening with guilt. He'd opened up to me, trusted me, and now I was the one putting up walls. The breaking point came on a Saturday night. Evan was sitting on the living room floor, sorting through a stack of photographs he'd printed. I sat on the couch behind him, nursing a glass of wine and pretending to read a book. He picked up a photo and held it up for me to see. "What do you think of this one?" I set the book down and leaned forward. It was a black and white shot of the beach at sunset, the waves crashing against the rocks. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm thinking of entering it in the art show at school." "You should. It's amazing." For a moment, he seemed genuinely happy, and I felt a warmth spread through me. Then he looked at me, his expression shifting to something more serious. "You're not mad at me, right?" The question caught me off guard. Why would I be mad? "I don't know," he said, fidgeting with the edge of the photo. "You've just been different lately." I set my glass down and sighed. "Evan, I'm not mad at you. I promise." He glanced at me, his eyes searching mine. "Then what's wrong?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? Instead, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Nothing's wrong," I said softly. "I'm just trying to figure things out. But it's not your fault, okay?" He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. Whatever was happening, whatever I was feeling, it didn't matter. Evan needed me, and I couldn't let my own confusion get in the way of being there for him. I'd made a promise to myself the day Daniel died. I wouldn't leave, and I intended to keep it, no matter what. The moment it happened, I knew it couldn't be undone. It was late, later than I usually stayed up. I'd been curled up on the couch, half asleep under a blanket, when I heard Evan's footsteps on the stairs. At first, I thought he was just getting a drink or heading to bed, but when I saw him standing in the doorway, shifting uncomfortably, I sat up. "Hey," I said, rubbing my eyes. "Everything okay?" Evan hesitated. His hands were fidgeting with his belt, the leather strap awkwardly twisted in his fingers. "It's stuck," he muttered, his voice quiet. "The buckle won't come loose." It was such a small, strange request, something that shouldn't have carried any weight, but the look on his face, embarrassed and vulnerable, caught me off guard. He looked younger in that moment, like the boy I'd first met, but there was also something else, something I couldn't name. "Let me see," I said softly, getting up and walking over to him. I can't stop staring at his belt, my fingers trembling as I pretend to focus on fixing the loose buckle. My stepson Evan towers over me, and I catch the scent of his cologne mixing with something raw and masculine that makes my head spin. "Hold still," I manage to say, trying to steady my voice as my knuckles graze his firm stomach. God, when did he get so grown? I need to punch a new hole in the leather, but all I can focus on is how close he's standing, how his presence seems to fill the entire room. "Like this?" His deep voice sends shivers down my spine. His hands settle on my shoulders, and I nearly drop the belt. My heart pounds so hard I'm sure he can hear it. I need to concentrate," I whisper, but I'm lying to myself. The belt slips from my fingers, landing softly on the carpet. His hands slide down my bare arms, leaving trails of fire in their wake. I can't help but tilt my head back, meeting his intense gaze. His fingers tangle in my hair, and I know I should stop this, but my body betrays me, arching toward him like a flower seeking the sun. "We shouldn't," I breathe, even as I press closer. "Shh," he soothes, one hand splaying across my lower back. When our lips meet, years of denied attraction explode between us. I melt against his chest, unable to hold back a soft moan as his tongue parts my lips. He presses me against the wall, his body encompassing mine completely. Every brush of his fingers along my collarbone draws gasps from my lips. "We fought this for so long," he groans against my neck, and I dig my nails into his shoulders, feeling his muscles flex beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. My silk blouse whispers against my skin as his hands explore my curves. "Tell me to stop," he pleads roughly, but I can only whimper and pull him closer, drowning in the forbidden pleasure of his touch. Time loses all meaning as we lose ourselves in each other. Each kiss grows deeper, more desperate. I feel dizzy with desire, drunk on the taste of him, on the solid press of his body against mine. That belt still lies forgotten on the floor, marking the moment everything changed between us. As Evan lifts me, wrapping my legs around his waist, I know we can never go back. And in this moment, with the late afternoon sun painting us in golden light, I don't want to. I should have stopped it, I should have drawn the line right then and there. But in that moment, with the weight of everything we'd been through pressing down on us, I didn't. Instead, I let myself close my eyes, just for a second, and leaned into the warmth of him. It was a mistake, a terrible, irrevocable mistake. But in that moment, it didn't feel like one. It felt like the only thing keeping us from falling apart. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. The events of the night before replayed in my mind like a broken record, each detail sharper and more painful than the last. I'd crossed a line I'd sworn I'd never cross. And now, I had to figure out how to face him. Evan was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, pouring himself a bowl of cereal. He looked up when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. The silence between us was heavy, and I could feel his eyes on me as I poured myself a cup of coffee. I wanted to say something, to address what had happened, to apologize, to make it right, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, Evan broke the silence. "About last night." I froze, my hand gripping the handle of the mug. "Evan, we shouldn't—" "I know," he said quickly. "I know, He trailed off, looking down at his cereal. It didn't feel wrong. The knot in my stomach tightened. "It was wrong," I said firmly, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Evan, I'm supposed to be—" "You're not my mom," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You're not anyone. You're just here." The words stung more than they should have. I opened my mouth to respond, but he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile. "I'm going to school," he muttered, grabbing his bag and heading for the door. I stood there, staring after him, the coffee in my hand growing cold. Evan didn't come straight home after school that day. The hours ticked by, and each passing moment weighed heavier on me. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was pacing the living room, my phone in hand, fighting the urge to call him. I didn't want to seem overbearing, but worry gnawed at me. When the front door finally creaked open just after 8, I froze. Evan stepped inside, his hair damp from the drizzle outside, his bag slung over one shoulder. He didn't meet my gaze as he slipped off his shoes and headed for the stairs. "Evan," I called after him, my voice softer than I intended. He paused but didn't turn around. "We need to talk," I said. He stood there for a moment, his shoulders stiff, before finally turning to face me. His expression was unreadable, his usual guardedness firmly in place. "There's nothing to talk about," he said flatly. "Yes, there is," I insisted, stepping closer. "Last night, it shouldn't have happened. We need to—" "I get it," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You regret it. Fine." "It's not about regret," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "It's about what's right. I'm supposed to take care of you, Evan. I'm supposed to—" "You're supposed to what?" he snapped, his eyes blazing. "Be my mom? Because you're not. You're not my mom, and you're not my dad. You're just here." The words cut deeper than they should have. I opened my mouth to respond, but he shook his head, his expression softening just slightly. "Look, I get it," he said, his voice quieter now. "You don't have to explain. It's not going to happen again." Before I could say anything, he turned and disappeared up the stairs, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. The days that followed were strained. Evan and I tiptoed around each other, our conversations reduced to polite, hollow exchanges. I'd ask him about school, and he'd answer in monosyllables. He'd spend hours in his room or out with his camera, avoiding me as much as possible. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. I kept telling myself that I'd done the right thing by addressing it, by drawing the line. But the guilt didn't go away. It wasn't just guilt over what had happened. It was guilt over the part of me that didn't want to push him away. The part of me that craved the connection, even if it was wrong. I hated myself for it. The tension finally came to a head one stormy evening. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance as I sat in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book. Evan came downstairs, his camera slung around his neck. He hesitated in the doorway, his eyes flicking toward me before he stepped inside. "Hey," he said awkwardly. I looked up, surprised. "Hey." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he cleared his throat and held up his camera. I got some shots of the storm. Thought you might want to see them." It was the first olive branch he'd offered since that night, and I wasn't about to refuse it. "Sure," I said, setting my book aside. He walked over and sat down on the couch beside me, closer than I expected. I could feel the warmth of him, the faint smell of rain lingering on his clothes. He scrolled through the photos, showing me shot after shot of lightning splitting the sky, rain dripping from the eaves of the house, and dark clouds roiling above the trees. "These are amazing," I said honestly. He glanced at me, his expression softening. "Thanks." For a moment, it felt like things were normal again, like we were back to being just Claire and Evan, stepmother and stepson, two people trying to navigate the aftermath of loss together. But then his hand brushed against mine, and the air shifted. I pulled back instinctively, but the damage was done. The tension was back, thick and suffocating. "I should go to bed," I said abruptly, standing up. Evan looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Claire." "Good night, Evan," I said quickly, cutting him off. He didn't stop me as I walked away, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. That night I lay awake again, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Evan needed stability, not confusion. He needed someone who could guide him, not someone who got lost in her own emotions. But no matter how much I told myself that, I couldn't ignore the connection we shared. It wasn't just about that night. It was about every moment leading up to it. The late-night conversations, the quiet understanding, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world who saw him. It wasn't love, not the way it should have been. But it was something. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy, I reached for it and saw a message from Evan's school principal. "Hi, Claire. Just wanted to let you know we've scheduled a meeting to discuss some behavioral concerns with Evan. Please call me when you get a chance." My stomach sank. I dressed quickly and headed downstairs, finding Evan at the kitchen table with his cereal. "We need to talk," I said, sitting across from him. His expression immediately hardened. "What now?" "I got a message from your principal," I said. "They want to talk about behavioral concerns." Evan's jaw tightened. "It's not a big deal." "It sounds like it is," I said firmly. "What's going on?" He didn't answer, staring down at his bowl instead. "Evan," I pressed, "talk to me." He finally looked up, his eyes flashing with frustration. "You want to know what's going on? Fine. I'm failing 2 classes and I got into a fight last week. Happy?" I blinked, taken aback. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you don't care," he snapped. "That's not fair," I said, my voice rising. "Of course I care." "Do you?" he shot back. "Because it feels like all you care about is avoiding me." His words hit harder than I expected. "This isn't about me," I said, struggling to keep my composure. "This is about you. If you're struggling, I want to help. But I can't do that if you shut me out." Evan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile. "You don't get it," he said, his voice shaking. "You never have." Before I could respond, he stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me sitting there, my heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. The letter came on an otherwise unremarkable day. I'd been going through some of Daniel's old boxes in the attic, sorting through papers and photos, trying to decide what to keep and what to let go. The box smelled faintly of mildew and age, its contents a time capsule of a life that now felt distant. At the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of insurance documents and faded receipts, I found an envelope with my name written on it, in Daniel's familiar handwriting. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. My chest tightened as I carefully tore it open, the paper inside yellowed and worn. Claire, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I didn't tell you this in person, but I didn't know how. I hope you can forgive me. Evan isn't my biological son. The words blurred as my vision swam. I blinked hard and forced myself to keep reading. His mother was my best friend, Rachel, and his father was her husband, Marcus. When they died in the accident, I promised I'd take care of Evan. I raised him as my own because I loved him like my own. I didn't tell him the truth because I didn't want him to feel any more loss than he already had. But I knew someday this truth might come out, and he would need someone to help him through it. I hope that person is you. Take care of him, Claire. He's a good boy, and he needs someone who loves him. The letter slipped from my hands, fluttering to the floor. Evan wasn't Daniel's son. He wasn't biologically tied to either of us. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. For years, I'd been navigating the fragile, complicated world of step-parenthood, walking a tightrope of boundaries and expectations, and now all of that was gone. Evan wasn't my stepson. He wasn't tied to me by blood or marriage. He was just Evan. I didn't tell him right away. The letter felt like a secret too big to share, a truth I needed time to process before I could explain it to him. But I couldn't hide the way it changed how I looked at him. That night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I found myself watching him more closely. The way his hands moved as he picked at his food, the furrow in his brow when he was lost in thought, it all felt sharper, more vivid. "What?" he asked, catching me staring. "Nothing," I said quickly, looking away. Evan narrowed his eyes, but he didn't push me. The shift wasn't one-sided. Over the next few days, I noticed Evan hovering more than usual, lingering in the kitchen while I cooked, sitting on the couch when I painted in the living room. He didn't say much, but his presence was constant, like he was trying to tell me something without words. One evening, as we watched a movie together, he spoke up. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you don't have to stay," he said, his voice hesitant. "I'm not your responsibility." I turned to look at him, my heart aching at the uncertainty in his eyes. "Evan, I'm not here because I have to be. I'm here because I want to be." His gaze searched mine, as if trying to decide whether to believe me. "Even if it's just me?" "Especially if it's just you," I said firmly. Something in his expression softened, and for the first time in days, he smiled. A small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. The revelation about Evan stayed between me and the letter for weeks. I couldn't bring myself to tell him, afraid of what it might do to him, to us. But it changed the way I saw him, and the way I saw myself. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, the tension between us finally came to a head. Evan had been unusually quiet all day, his gaze distant, and his answers clipped. I could feel the weight of whatever was on his mind, and it was driving me crazy. "Evan," I said finally, breaking the silence, "what's going on?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally looked at me, his expression was raw, unguarded. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice low. The question hit harder than I expected. "What do you mean?" I asked softly. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice trembling. "I mean, it's not like we're really family." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I felt my chest tighten as I realized what he was trying to say. "Evan," I began, but he shook his head. "I don't want anyone else," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't want another family, or another mom, or anyone else. I just want—" His words trailed off, but the look in his eyes said everything he couldn't say. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and cupped his face in my hands. His skin was warm under my palms, and he leaned into the touch, his eyes closing as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Evan," I whispered, my voice shaking. When his eyes opened, they were filled with something I couldn't ignore, something that mirrored the feelings I'd been trying so hard to bury. I don't want anyone else either, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. And just like that, the line we'd been walking for so long disappeared. I remember one moment we had together. Oh God, it was beautiful. I kneel before Evan, hands resting gently on his thighs as I gaze up, lost in the intensity of the moment. His fingers softly caress through my hair, each touch sending tingles down my spine. The bedside lamp casts a warm glow across the room, softening all edges. Claire. The way he whispers my name makes my heart flutter. I press delicate kisses against his stomach, feeling the subtle quiver of muscles beneath warm skin. His scent surrounds me, clean soap mixed with something uniquely him. My fingers trace patterns on his legs as I continue my tender exploration. His breath catches when I place feather-light kisses along his lower abdomen. The power of these gentle moments between us is intoxicating. Every soft touch draws a reaction. Please, he breathes, and I love hearing that note of yearning in his voice. I take my time, savoring each moment, each kiss. My lipstick leaves faint traces on his skin, like an artist signing their work. When I finally begin to please him properly, his quiet sounds of pleasure fill the room. My hands rest on his thighs as I lavish attention on him, drawing out sighs and gentle moans I never imagined I'd hear. His breathing grows uneven as I continue my tender ministrations. Looking up, I see his head tilted back, completely lost in sensation. It fills me with a deep satisfaction to bring him such pleasure. Claire. I'm close, he warns softly. I continue my gentle attention until he finds his release with a quiet gasp of my name. After, he draws me up into his arms, kissing me tenderly. Let me return the favor, he whispers against my ear as he guides me back onto the soft sheets. In the days that followed, the world outside seemed to blur. Inside the house, it was just the two of us. No rules, no boundaries, just the quiet understanding that we were all each other had. But the truth still loomed, unspoken but inevitable. Evan needed to know, and I needed to be the one to tell him. One night, as we sat together on the couch, I took a deep breath and handed him the letter. This is from your dad, I said softly. Evan frowned, unfolding the paper. As his eyes scanned the words, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, to something I couldn't quite name. He wasn't my dad, he said finally, his voice quiet. He was in every way that mattered, I said quickly. Evan looked up at me, his eyes searching mine. And you? I'm still here, I said. And I'm not going anywhere. The look he gave me then was one I'd never forget, a mix of relief, gratitude, and something far deeper. I don't care about the rest, he said softly. I just care about you. And in that moment, I knew the truth. We weren't bound by blood or marriage, but by something far stronger. We were each other's everything. The guilt I once had was now absent. We had each other, and that is what mattered.